This is May the 2nd, 2022. I'm with Ajahn Punnadhammo in Northern Ontario and Punnadhammo in South Carolina. We're going to talk about mysticism in Theravada Buddhism, since we're all Theravada Buddhists. So Ajahn Punnadhammo, would you like to start off?
Okay. Well, I guess the first question that comes up with this theme is what are we defining as mysticism? And maybe you gentlemen have some ideas about that. Because I think that, I think that the common idea of mysticism, it's kind of hard to define. It's practices or beliefs that that develop kind of internal powers and access different levels of consciousness and so on. And defined broadly like that, it's clear, all Buddhism could be called mysticism, because we're trying to develop states of consciousness beyond the mundane. But I think there's also a kind of a narrower framework of mysticism, practices that we would call mysticism, that would be things like working with the energy bodies and chakras and kundalini, or contacting other realms, entities in other realms. That would be a form of mysticism. Or magical healing, all those sorts of things.
I should also mention in the introduction, you're the author of the book, The Buddhist Cosmos, which is like the main book on hundreds of years on Theravada Buddhist cosmology. So yeah, this is something that you've studied well in terms of the higher realms,
Yeah. So, let's, before we go on any further, let's maybe hear from the two of you how you would define the term mysticism, because I think that would narrow the discussion.
Yeah, well, the topic idea was Punnadhammo's idea, so let's let Punnadhammo define that.
Okay, Punnadhammo, how do you define mysticism?
All right, well, mysticism does have more than one definition. Like if you look it up in the dictionary, like one definition is just a kind of derogatory, just sloppy thinking. It's like some people can call sloppy thinking mysticism, but when I talk about mysticism or consider myself to be mystically inclined, it's a matter of trying to understand to know the highest truth without thinking. But it's like thinking is like symbolic thoughts. It's paññāti. It's not the reality that you're trying to get to. So you can't really get to reality by thinking about it. You have to just directly experience it. So that direct experience of reality, without having to think at all, to experience it or to know it, that's what I would consider to be mysticism in the highest sense.
Okay, well, that's then definitely congruent with Buddhism, because one of the qualities is yata bhutananadasana, knowledge and vision of things as they are, which is the direct apperception of reality, cutting through theory and sankharas and just being aware of dhammas in their actual own nature. That's the essence of doing vipassana, for example.
Yeah,
So,
it'd be a certain level of it, at least, anyway. Although, like, I lived in Burma for many years, and it just seems that they might give some kind of mysticism lip service, although you may know that in Burma, monks take Abhidhamma very seriously.
yes.
And the Abhidhamma Pitaka and the associated commentarial literature, it claims to explain reality. And so that you've got a lot of scholar monks, and there are plenty of scholar monks in Burma who study these books and think that they know reality, when really, it's just ideas about reality. It's paññāti or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So that kind of clarifies the distinction here. because I know also know Burma has this very strong tradition of Vipassana, which I think Vipassana in its essence would fit your definition of mysticism. Now, if you're doing
To some
Vipassana
degree, yeah.
if you're doing Vipassana properly, as I understand it, you're observing reality in its basic nature. Like when I teach Vipassana to people, I'm always telling them to cut through concepts and get to observe what's actually occurring at this moment in the mind directly. You know, so I've always thought that was an interesting pairing of specialties in Burma, that Vipassana on the one hand and Abhidhamma on the other. It's like theory and practice. You know, Ajahn Chah was kind of dismissive of Abhidhamma, and a lot of the Thai forest tradition has been dismissive of Abhidhamma. When somebody asked Ajahn Chah once, how much Abhidhamma should we study? He said, all my Abhidhamma is right here.
Yeah, I think probably most Western monks, just setting aside Western lay people, but probably most Western monks, maybe 70% really don't believe that it's genuine Dhamma, or genuine teachings of the historical Gautama Buddha. There are some, but I think probably most do not.
No,
I
have a great deal of respect and interest in Abhidhamma, but I certainly am highly skeptical of Abhidhamma as being directly Buddha Vachana. And one reason for that, I think, from historical critical point of view, you can look at the Abhidhamma Pitakas of the different schools of Buddhism. The only one we have really complete is Theravada, but we have some significant portions of some other ones in Chinese and Tibetan translation. And they're all over the place. They don't agree with each other at all. Although some of them they agree in fundamental principles, the details are quite different, and even the structure of the text, the layout, and so on. So my feeling is that Abhidhamma in the early days has served as a kind of a manifesto for each school, that they all shared the common Sutta Pitaka, but there's a lot of room for interpretation and variation if you're just going on the suttas alone. So they would say, like, this is how we understand it, and they kind of cross the T's and dot the I's and fill in the blanks, and that's Abhidhamma.
Well, wasn't it composed like about 2 centuries after the Buddha? Like, isn't it understood and agreed that the Buddha didn't teach that? It was after his death.
Well, the traditional account is the Buddha taught Abhidhamma to the Devas and Tawa thinks of heaven.
Yeah, and then channeled it down to earth. Yeah, I've read that.
And Sariputta then passed it on, right? And the Matakas, which is sort of like the table of contents, so the brief summary at the beginning of each of the 7 Abhidhamma books is, or at least for 6 of them, is said to be directly the words of the Buddha, and the rest is Sariputta's commentary.
But couldn't they tell historically that it was actually composed 1 or 2 centuries later? I mean, in terms of religious scholars and historians.
Yeah, that's probably true. I did see one academic article that made an interesting argument that the Abhidhamma was not possible to be developed before writing was widespread, because the presentation of Abhidhamma, if you've seen, if you've ever looked in Abhidhamma books, secondary books on Abhidhamma, they always have tables and charts, and right. Chitta's down one side and Chittasuka's on the other, and it would be very difficult to hold that stuff in your mind with a linear presentation delivered orally. You have to have it written down so you can keep referring back and put the framework together.
I guess the suttas is enough to remember. I just want to comment on my take on mysticism. Talk about that. I guess. I think in my own mind, I always thought of it as something beyond our regular 3rd dimension, like this everyday reality. Like I've had experiences when I was younger, I felt were like channeling states or just states of mind, which are seem to be higher, inspired or whatever, and out of the normal reality, and something that might be useful or maybe not, but that's kind of my feeling about what I always thought of as mysticism. Of course, the definitions you gave were very good too, like about reality, seeing things as they really are.
Yeah, it's like I would consider mysticism in Theravada to be largely like samatha, or like, you know, once you get into jhana, above first jhana, you're not thinking anymore.
Right.
And then you're getting into like the highest attainable state is, you know, according to the text, is the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. Even though, I mean, you're not really, I mean, I'm skeptical of the idea that you'd be completely unconscious or just completely oblivious to everything around you in a state like that. Wouldn't it actually be more of an expanded consciousness state? And so I would consider that to be about the best example, or one of the best examples of mysticism in Theravada Buddhism. It would just be the cultivating these higher jhana states. And I've also read some like Catholic Christian mysticism, or like the contemplative schools, or what do you call them? The orders of Roman Catholicism, like Saint John of the Cross. He's the mystical doctor of the Roman Catholic Church, and it seems to me, based on what he was writing, that he was a master of fourth jhana. That he had attained fourth jhana, and he talks about how, like, his way of meditating. I mean, it's very Christian in the theory, but the practice is very similar to some Buddhist meditation. Is that you just dismiss from your mind anything that is not God. And so, I mean, you can't understand God intellectually, so you dismiss the intellect. You can't understand God like through your senses, so you dismiss that. You can't understand God emotionally, anything like that, so you just dismiss. And then finally, you know, your mind is empty. You're not thinking anything, but still there's something there. And he called that dark faith. It was like the direct experience of, you know, from the Catholic point of view, the spirit of God, the presence of God that pervades the universe. And a Buddhist would explain it very differently, but still, I think a lot of Buddhists have, Theravada Buddhists especially, I think, they've become so dependent on theory, you know, systematic theory like Abhidhamma and the commentaries and so forth, that this just wide open, empty but not blank, this sort of mental state, which is a mystical state. Because, I mean, you can't really understand reality by thinking about it, because thoughts are just symbols, and so you just have to directly experience it directly.
Yes. Yeah, that's very good. I mean, I've seen those kind of parallels with I've talked to Christian monks before, and I've had that feeling that although the terminology and the language is quite different, I think they're accessing the same kind of inner states.
Yeah.
But then when you step back from it and try to explain it, you're going to naturally couch it in the language that of the system you've been trained in, and so it's going to sound different.
Yeah, getting back to Buddhism, though, I think, or I have read that one of the reasons why Mahayana arose was as a reaction against all this intellectual systematology. You know, Abhidhamma. Most of the earlier schools had some sort of Abhidhamma or something similar to Abhidhamma.
Yeah.
And they were trying to get back towards just, you know, just not thinking. Like a Zen Buddhism, especially, where you've got Zen koans and so forth. You have to meditate on this riddle that has no answer until finally your mind just shuts down, and then you get this flash of insight.
Yeah.
I want to ask you too about Tibetan Buddhism. I think of that as mysticism with the Buddhism I started with Shambhala in 1991. I was initiated in their higher realm channeling practices, you know. Don't you think Tibetan Buddhism, with all of their deities, like, don't you think that's overtly quite mystical compared to Theravada or even in Zen?
Yeah, it is in that way, but I think it's not what's often overlooked is that there's those are all, most of the stuff that we identify as being exclusively Tibetan are embellishments of seeds you can find in the Theravada. Like we've talked about contemplation of devas, that's a traditional practice that's in the Visuddhimagga.
Yeah, I'd like to recommend for the audience, you have a guided meditation on the contemplation of devas on your website. I can put a link below this video. I've done that many times. That's very good. Yeah.
Yeah, and Punnadhammo brought up that in the formless abiding, so that's another that would be considered by many a mystical experience, you know, to touch on the formless states. There's also mention in more than one place in the canon of supernormal powers, like the divine eye and divine ear, multiplication of bodies, and so on. Well, this would all fit in with the idea of mysticism.
Now, one thing that influenced me in the suttas, the Buddha said, visualize a confidence-inspiring object. That one sentence to me justifies all this, like David visualization on Saka and other, because anything that inspires you, visualize a constant. So would you describe it as one of the seeds, you know, of Tibetan Buddhism within Theravada?
Yeah. What else was going to say? Oh, and on a more general kind of a note about specifically mystical traditions within Theravada Buddhism, there have been in Thailand and in Sri Lanka also, there have been strong movements of kind of magical practices and magical healing and astrology and so on that are all they're not specifically Buddhist, but the culture is so Buddhist it ends up being totally intertwined with Buddhism. I saw when I was in Thailand, I had an experience seeing a traditional healer, a snake doctor, cure a man from a cobra bite through purely kind of magical means. And the fellow had been bitten on the heel by a cobra, and his whole leg was horrible looking. You know, after it went all kind of black and blue, like a color like you have when you have a bruise, but it was, you know, right up well above his knee and swollen. And this snake doctor came and did his hocus pocus, and the color faded down to, was just like a little bit of pink, more like a sunburn color, and the swelling went away completely, and he got up and walked away right as rain.
So he was cured from that.
Yeah.
Wow. Was he chanting or visualizing or invoking devas or what?
It was chanting was the main thing, and the chanting was done. It was also gestures, chanting and gestures, but the chanting was done very low, like a subtle voice, and with his face down near the wound, and he muttered the chant. And I was told they do that deliberately so that no one can steal their secret mantras. And the mantras are in Old Khmer, which in Thailand is considered to be like the magical language. It's a relic from the previous civilization, the Khmer Empire.
That's really something, eh? Wow, that's mysticism.
Yeah, I'd say that there's an element of mysticism in that sort of magical or like psychic powers, in the sense that in a way you're breaking down the structure of what people consider to be possible. You know, it's like the samsara, what do you call it, the conventional truth. You know, people are locked into a conventional truth that some things are possible, other things are impossible. And if you start practicing mysticism to some degree, then, you know, a lot of this conventional truth just disappears, and then you've got possibilities can well up through that.
Yes.
But in Theravada, I think mysticism is somewhat controversial. Like before we started the recording, I was mentioning one of the most famous Western monks is Jnana, who lived in Sri Lanka in the 50s and 60s, and he just despised mysticism because, according to him, it violated the laws of thought. It was just sloppy thinking. It's like mystics was like the Diamond Cutter Sutra in Mahayana says, the bodhisattva is a bodhisattva because there is no bodhisattva. It's just all this sort of contradictory talk that, according to an intellectual like Jnana, it was just nonsense. It was just worthless.
Yeah.
And then also, the Abhidhamma scholars who, they might give a certain amount of lip service to mysticism, but still, they're locked into this systematic explanation of reality that in a way kind of handicaps them from going beyond that. And then, of course, in the West, people are very much into just scientific explanations of things with some Buddhist flavoring added to that. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I know there's a big, there has been always a big controversy between the Thai forest tradition and the literalism, the scriptural literalism of like the Sri Lankan tradition. A lot of the Sri Lankan tradition, the Buddhist Publication Society of Sri Lanka won't publish Ajahn Mun or Ajahn Mahabua.
No, I didn't know that.
I know about Ajahn Mahabua because he basically claimed to be an arahant around 1963.
Well, that's not the real bone of contention.
Oh,
there are doctrinal issues, particularly revolving around the nature of chitta, and this as you're mentioning about Abhidhamma, this is a place where it really comes into the difference between the kind of mystical approach and the theoretical approach. Because Ajahn Mun, for example, is quite explicit in one of, there's very little of his direct teaching left, but there's one poem that he wrote that is well known in Thailand, and he mentions in there the shining chitta outside of the five khandhas, which is a total violation of Abhidhamma theory.
wow. So they don't allow the publication of Ajahn Mun at the Buddhist Publication Society in Sri Lanka?
No,
I didn't
because
know that.
he's heretic according to their...
Wow, he's our founder of the forest tradition. Oh.
That is interesting, although there are a couple of suttas, one in the Majjhima Nikaya, I think the other in the Digha Nikaya, that does seem to have an old fragment of verse implying at least that Nibbana is infinite formless consciousness, luminous all around, this kind of thing.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. Luminous, boundless, and finds no footing.
Yeah.
And the Pali's a little obscure, and that passage occurs twice that I know of, and once in the, as you say, once in Digha and once in Majjhima, and both Bhikkhu Bodhi and Maurice Walsh, the translators, for that passage they have long footnotes.
Yeah,
definitely,
because it does seem to be heretical, like maybe like pre-Theravadan, before they settled on a certain interpretation of things.
Oh, perhaps, yeah. I hadn't thought of that as it being a kind of a relic of, but that Ajahn Mun's teaching is, definitely outside the bounds of strict Theravada. And also, if you've read, I don't know if either of you have read Ajahn Mahabua's biography of Ajahn Mun.
Yeah, I've read it.
Yeah, and he describes the arahants of the past came to him, which is not possible. It's impossible. Arahants are gone.
Yeah, the Buddha,
that's concerned me.
The Buddha and the arahants come and visit.
No, it cannot be.
And you know what I find really kind of amusing and very Thai about that particular passage is he has the Buddha and the arahants in front of him, and he has a chance to ask a question, and he asks some niggling question about Vinaya.
Yeah, it's like what color were their robes or something like that.
Yeah.
But this is Mahabua's account. Like Ajahn Mun didn't say this particularly, as far as you know. Mahabua made this.
Well, this is
claim.
Mahabua recounting what Ajahn Mun had told him, I suppose.
Okay. If that's the case, who knows? Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that Thailand, like Theravada Buddhism in Thailand, has a certain advantage and disadvantage at the same time, in that I think it was like 1700s, the Burmese just made this unprovoked attack and sacked the capital, which caused like the ecclesiastical structure of Thailand to sort of collapse, like their universities and so forth. And they never fully recovered from that. So Thai Ajahns, much more than Burmese Sayadaws, teach more from their own understanding based on their own experience rather than according to what the book says.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a very true. There's a lot of there's a lot more kind of what's the word I'm looking for, the heterodox sort of teachings, you know,
Yeah.
that a little bit outside the box teachings you can find in Thailand.
Yeah, and sometimes they'll like be very give you very strange interpretations of Pali terms and so forth.
Yeah.
Like I can't remember his name. I won't try to recall the name, but I remember one time an Australian monk in Burma showed me this little book, a translation of a Thai Ajahn, a relatively famous one, and he thought it was funny just because of the strange interpretations of the Pali terms and so forth, because apparently he wasn't much of a Pali scholar. But and still, I mean, by reading that, you can tell that he was teaching based on his own personal experience to some degree, at least. You know, he had something based on, you know, his own meditative attainments and so forth. But there's another thing I would like to mention before I forget, and that's what you were mentioning, Ajahn, about the consciousness that exists beyond the five khandhas. And I've encountered a number of Western Buddhists, only Westerners for some reason, that are using that vehemently as a claim of a self. You know, they just cannot stand anatta. And so there's this you know, infinite consciousness or something like the Hindu Brahman, like of the Brahman of the Upanishads, that is the true self. And it's, you know, it's not any of the five khandhas or anything. And it's really odd to me that they are so vehement about it.
Yeah, I've encountered that too, that there's I think that's something, you know, that's not entirely new to our times, that there's always been movements to kind of creep the Atman back into Buddhism.
Yeah, you even had the Pugalavadins.
Pugalavadins, yeah. Right.
Yeah, they believed in a Pugala or an individual, but anatta was already established, so they couldn't really call it a self. They would just call it an individual or something.
Yeah. I think there is some, maybe shifting a little bit, another kind of stream of heterodox and mystical teachings in Thai Buddhism is via Ajahn Lee. That's a very interesting branch. And he spent a lot of time in India, and he's one of the very few Theravada teachers who teaches explicitly a meditation based on the chakras, moving the consciousness through the chakras. Although he doesn't use that language, he talks about visualizing a ball of light. And first of all, you're breathing through your nose, then you shift to breathing through the middle of your forehead, then you breathe through the top of the head, then you visualize a ball of light in the center of your skull and draw it down through the body to the base and then up again to the heart.
Yeah, I think the book that I was mentioning, I couldn't remember the name. I think it might have been by Ajahn Lee Damodaro.
Yeah.
And that's a practice that Ajahn Thanissaro has really popularized. I've known him for 20 years, and he teaches that. But Ajahn, you also teach guided meditations on the chakras. I listened to some of your talks on that.
Yeah, I like working with the chakras, but I always careful when I when I teach that, that I'm, saying this is not really strictly Theravada Buddhism.
Yeah, you always have that preface, so you're a good monk that way.
Yeah, I try and, not confuse things.
Yeah, I try to do that also. I usually specify if I'm deviating from orthodoxy, if I'm trying to explain something.
Yeah.
So with mysticism, some people say it's good, some people say it's bad. I guess that was kind of one of what the vote is. You're saying some people say, well, this is not right, but probably most would say it's okay.
Yeah, there is an interesting thing that I've noticed in that some really brilliant intellectuals just cannot understand mysticism, like Stephen Hawking, who was sort of a guru of science
Yeah.
back
And
in the 80s and 90s,
atheism, right?
especially.
Atheism.
Well, I mean, he was a scientist. I mean, he may have given God some lip service, but he was definitely a scientist who believed that, the universe obeys the laws of physics and so forth. And he said that mysticism just obscures the issues. Although personally, I think it's the other way around, that the issues obscure mysticism. And also like Bertrand Russell, he wrote a book about mysticism where he was just essentially saying he had no use for it. And he really didn't understand it, because if you're completely locked into thinking, trying to understand through concepts, and you have no concept of anything beyond that, then I mean, a lot of people would think that if you stop thinking, there's just going to be blackness or just blankness.
Yeah.
And that's one of the most powerful insights you get from practicing meditation, is realizing that when the thinking stops, you don't stop. I mean, it's not you essentially, but I mean, it doesn't just go blank. That actually you're more conscious when you're not thinking than when you are thinking, or at least you can be more conscious.
Exactly. And I think we forget that a lot of people, probably most people in the world, they don't have that understanding, and they confuse thinking with consciousness.
Yeah.
Like they're the same thing. And if you're not thinking, you're not conscious.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes I tell people that the closest the average person comes to enlightenment is when they're in the middle of a sneeze, when they're wide awake and they're not thinking anything.
Yeah, that's good. The Tibetan teaching about the relative to a sneeze. You heard this? There's there are 4 times that a person naturally experiences has an experience of the white light, which is the closest thing to being, totally enlightened, is the white light experience, they call it. And in order of from strongest to weakest, it's the moment of death, the moment of falling asleep, the moment of orgasm, and the moment of sneezing.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I think sneezing might bring you closer than orgasm, just because there's so much turmoil and sensuality going on with the orgasm.
Yeah, it's less attachment on sneeze. Yeah, so anything else on mysticism? We could go on to another topic. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I've pretty much had my say, although it really is important for people to understand that you're not going to understand reality by thinking about it. And you can sort of understand the limitations of your own mind, and you can understand certain things about samsara. But if you want to know the highest truth, you're going to have to leave thinking behind to some degree. And because you just have to experience reality directly, because concepts are just like symbols. It's like TREE on a piece of paper is radically different from a real tree. And when you're thinking, that's essentially what you're doing, is you're just using these symbols that are supposedly standing for something else in an attempt to understand reality. And it just doesn't work that way. You're just going to have to leave the thinking behind, or transcend the thinking somehow, and just experience reality directly.
I concur.
Yeah, and like Immanuel Kant, getting into Western philosophy, he had this idea that there is the thing in itself. There is the ultimate reality, but we have no way of knowing it. But it seems to me that there is a thing in itself, like a Kantian thing in itself, that we can know directly, and that is the thing in itself of our own consciousness. So I mean, that's sort of what like jhanic states would be, where you're dismissing all the content, all the thinking, and just sort of experiencing your consciousness directly, in a sense.
Yeah. Any final words, Ajahn, Punnadhammo?
No, I think Punnadhammo summed that up pretty good. I don't really have anything substantial to add to that. The whole thing about not mistaking the finger for the moon, the Zen line.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And I should also tell the audience, Ajahn Punnadhammo has been a Buddhist monk for 30 years, a senior monk, and Punnadhammo was a Buddhist monk for 30 years. I was a layperson. So much metta. I don't want to say gentlemen, this is a monk here, Ajahn and Punnadhammo, and more videos to come.
Okay.